The clock on Officer Blake's dashboard showed 8:47 p.m. as he slowly cruised through the downtown district. The streets were quieter than usual for a Tuesday evening, with most office workers already heading home to their families. Blake had been patrolling this area for 3 years now, and he knew every corner, every building, and most importantly, who belonged here and who didn't. His radio crackled softly with dispatch calls from other parts of the city, but his sector remained peaceful. Blake took a sip from his lukewarm coffee and glanced at the federal building complex up ahead. The imposing structure housed several government offices, and its marble steps gleamed under the streetlights. This was the kind of neighborhood where important people worked, where decisions that affected thousands of lives were made every day. That's when he spotted him. A black man in his late 40s was walking with purpose toward the federal building. He wore a dark navy suit that looked expensive, carried a leather briefcase, and moved with the confidence of someone who had somewhere important to be. But something about the scene didn't sit right with Blake. His years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were telling him that this man was out of place. Blake slowed his patrol car to get a better look. The man walked up the steps of the federal building, pulled out what appeared to be a key card, and swiped it at the security entrance. The light turned green and he disappeared inside. That's strange, Blake muttered to himself. He made a mental note and continued his patrol, but something nagged at him. 20 minutes later, as he completed his loop around the district, he saw the same man exiting the building. This time, instead of heading toward the parking garage where most employees kept their cars, the man started walking down the street. Blake's suspicions grew stronger. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. now. What kind of legitimate business would someone have in a government building at this hour? And why was he walking instead of driving? The more Blake thought about it, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. He decided to follow at a distance. The man walked 2 blocks before stopping at an upscale Italian restaurant. Through the large windows, Blake could see him greeting another man in a suit, and they sat down at a corner table. The restaurant was the kind of place where business deals were made over expensive wine and pasta. Blake watched for a few minutes, then decided to continue his patrol. An hour and a half later, Blake was completing another round when he saw the man again. This time he was walking back toward the federal building, still carrying his briefcase, still looking like he owned the world. But Blake's mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe the man had been scoping out the building earlier. Maybe the dinner was a cover story. Maybe he was planning something. Blake had seen enough crime shows and attended enough training sessions to know that criminals often did reconnaissance before committing serious crimes. Government buildings were prime targets, and it was his job to protect them. The fact that this man was black only reinforced Blake's assumptions. In his experience, people who looked like this man didn't usually have legitimate business in places like this. He made his decision. Blake flipped on his patrol car's overhead lights and pulled up alongside the man. The blue and red lights painted the sidewalk in alternating colors, casting long shadows between the streetlights. He rolled down his window and called out, "Excuse me, sir. Can I have a word with you?" The man stopped walking and turned toward the patrol car. Up close, Blake could see that he was well-groomed, with graying temples and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But Blake had learned not to be fooled by appearances. Some of the smartest criminals he'd encountered had looked just as respectable. The man approached the patrol car with measured steps. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Blake studied the man's face, looking for signs of nervousness or guilt. "I'm Officer Blake with the city police. I've noticed you walking around this area for the past couple of hours. Mind telling me what you're doing here?" "I work in the federal building," the man replied calmly. "I had a dinner meeting and I'm heading back to my office to finish up some paperwork." Blake's eyebrows raised. "You work in the federal building? This late at night?" "Sometimes the work requires long hours," the man said with a slight smile. "I'm sure you understand, being in law enforcement yourself." Something about the man's composed demeanor irritated Blake. He was being too calm, too polite. In Blake's experience, innocent people were usually more nervous when questioned by police. This level of composure suggested someone who had practice dealing with law enforcement, and that was rarely a good sign. Blake decided to get out of his car for a closer look. As he approached, he noticed the man's expensive watch, his polished shoes, and the quality of his suit. Everything about him screamed money and education. But Blake had arrested wealthy criminals before. Rich people committed crimes too, sometimes the biggest ones. Can I see some identification? Blake asked, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. The man nodded and reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. He pulled out a wallet and handed over his driver's license. Blake examined it under his flashlight. The name read Dr. David Washington, with an address in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Doctor, huh? Blake said, not hiding his skepticism. What kind of doctor works in a government building at 9:30 at night? The kind that takes his responsibilities seriously, Washington replied, maintaining his patient tone. Blake studied the license more carefully. It looked legitimate, but these days, fake IDs were getting more sophisticated. He'd seen forgeries that could fool most people. The address was definitely upscale, but that didn't prove anything either. So you're telling me you're some kind of government doctor? Working late on a Tuesday night? Walking around instead of driving your car? I prefer to walk when the weather's nice, Washington said. It helps me think. And yes, I do work for the government. Blake found himself growing more suspicious by the minute. The man's answers were too smooth, too prepared. He was either telling the truth or he was a very good liar. Based on Blake's experience with the kinds of people who usually wandered around this neighborhood at night, he was betting on the latter. What exactly do you do in that building? Blake pressed. Washington paused for just a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. I work in civil rights oversight, making sure government agencies follow proper procedures. Blake almost laughed out loud. Civil rights oversight? This was getting ridiculous. The man was obviously making things up as he went along. What were the odds that someone in such a high-level position would be wandering around at night, having dinner meetings and then going back to work? Civil rights, huh? Blake said, his voice dripping with disbelief. That's convenient. And I suppose you just happened to be working late tonight on some important civil rights case. Actually, yes, Washington replied, his patience still intact, but Blake could detect a slight edge creeping into his voice. Blake looked around the empty street, then back at the man standing in front of him. Every instinct he had developed over his years as a police officer was telling him that something was off about this situation. Maybe the man wasn't planning to rob the building, but he was definitely not who he claimed to be, and Blake intended to find out the truth. Blake continued to stare at Washington's driver's license under his flashlight, looking for any sign that it might be fake. The longer he studied it, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. The man standing in front of him was too calm, too collected for someone being questioned by police at night. Most people would be nervous, asking why they were being stopped, but this man just stood there like he had all the time in the world. Dr. Washington, Blake said, drawing out the title with obvious skepticism. Tell me more about this civil rights job of yours. What exactly do you do there? Washington shifted his briefcase to his other hand and looked directly at Blake. I oversee compliance reviews, investigate discrimination complaints, and work with various agencies to ensure they're following federal civil rights laws. The answer came too quickly, too smoothly. Blake had interrogated enough suspects to know when someone was feeding him a rehearsed story. He decided to push harder. And how long have you been doing this job? 8 years in this position, 15 years total in civil rights law. Blake nodded slowly, pretending to consider this information. And your boss is okay with you working this late? Walking around the streets instead of being home with your family? For the first time, Washington's expression changed slightly. There was a flash of something, irritation maybe, or recognition of where this conversation was heading. Officer, I appreciate your diligence, but I'm not sure what law I'm breaking by walking down a public street after having dinner with a colleague. That did it. The man's tone had shifted from polite cooperation to something that sounded dangerously close to attitude. In Blake's experience, guilty people always got defensive when pressed for details about their stories. Nobody said you were breaking any laws, Blake replied, taking a step closer. I'm just trying to understand what you're really doing here. This is a high-security area, and we take threats to government buildings very seriously. Threats? Washington's voice rose slightly. Officer, I showed you my identification. I explained that I work in the building. What exactly are you suggesting? Blake could feel the situation escalating, but he was convinced he was on the right track. The man was getting agitated, which meant Blake was hitting close to home. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking questions, which is my job. And right now your story isn't adding up. Washington took a deep breath, clearly trying to control his emotions. What part of my story isn't adding up? I work in the federal building. I had dinner at a restaurant 2 blocks away. I'm walking back to finish some work. I've provided identification. What more do you need? I need to understand why someone claiming to be a high-level government employee is wandering around at night instead of driving like a normal person. I need to know why you're so calm about being questioned. And I need to know what you were really doing in that restaurant for an hour and a half. The questions hung in the air between them. Blake could see that Washington was struggling to remain composed, and he took that as confirmation that his instincts had been right. Innocent people didn't get angry when asked reasonable questions by police officers. Washington looked up and down the empty street, then back at Blake. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this feels less like a security check and more like harassment. I've answered your questions, shown you my identification, and explained my presence here. What exactly do you want from me? Blake felt his own frustration rising. The man was good at playing the victim, but Blake wasn't going to fall for it. He'd seen this act before. Criminals who tried to turn the tables by claiming they were being mistreated. What I want is the truth, Blake said firmly. Your whole story sounds made up. Civil rights director, working at 9:30 at night, having business dinners? Come on, man. Do you really expect me to believe that? Whether you believe it or not doesn't change the fact that it's true, Washington replied. His voice steady, but Blake could hear the underlying tension. Just then, another patrol car turned the corner, its headlights sweeping across the scene. Blake felt a surge of relief. Backup was always good when dealing with uncooperative suspects. The car pulled up behind Blake's vehicle, and Officer Torres stepped out. Rosa Torres had been Blake's partner for 2 years before being reassigned to a different patrol route. She was a good cop, thorough and professional, and Blake trusted her judgment. She walked over to where Blake and Washington were standing, taking in the situation with experienced eyes. Everything okay here, Blake? Torres asked, her hand resting casually on her radio. Just doing a security check on this gentleman, Blake replied, emphasizing the word gentleman in a way that made his skepticism clear. He claims to be some kind of government big shot, but his story's got more holes than Swiss cheese. Torres looked at Washington, noting his expensive suit and professional appearance. Something about the situation felt off to her, but not in the way Blake seemed to think. The man didn't look like a typical suspect. He looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a government executive. Sir, can you tell me what's going on here? Torres asked Washington directly. Washington turned to her gratefully. Officer, I work in the federal building. I had dinner with a colleague and was returning to my office when your partner stopped me. I've shown him my identification and explained my situation, but he seems to think I'm lying about who I am. Torres glanced at Blake, who was shaking his head in disbelief. Let me see the ID, she said. Blake handed over Washington's driver's license. Torres examined it carefully, noting the quality of the document, the address, and the man's appearance. Unlike Blake, she wasn't looking for reasons to disbelieve the ID. She was looking at it objectively. Dr. David Washington, she read aloud. Lives on Elm Street. She looked up at Washington. That's a nice neighborhood. My wife and I have lived there for 12 years, Washington replied. Torres noticed that unlike most people who were nervous around police, Washington made direct eye contact and answered her questions without hesitation. His body language was relaxed, not defensive. He wasn't sweating, fidgeting, or showing any of the typical signs of deception she'd been trained to recognize. Blake, what exactly made you stop Dr. Washington? Torres asked. Blake felt like he was losing control of the situation. Torres was supposed to be backing him up, not questioning his judgment. I saw him walking around the federal building multiple times tonight. Going in and out, having dinner, walking instead of driving. It looked suspicious. You saw him go into the building? Torres asked. Yeah, with some kind of key card. Torres turned back to Washington. You have access to the building after hours? Yes, I do. Many of us do when we have cases that require extended work hours. Blake jumped back in. Torres, don't you see what's happening here? He's got an answer for everything. It's too convenient. But Torres was looking at the situation differently. She'd worked with Blake long enough to know that he sometimes let his assumptions cloud his judgment. And right now she was seeing a well-dressed professional man being treated like a criminal, for the apparent crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dr. Washington, what kind of work do you do exactly? Torres asked. I'm the Regional Director of Civil Rights Enforcement for the Department of Justice, Washington replied. I oversee civil rights compliance for federal agencies in this region. Torres felt a chill run down her spine. If this man was telling the truth, and every indication suggested he was, then Blake had just racially profiled one of the most powerful civil rights officials in the region. She looked at Washington more carefully, wondering if she should recognize him from news coverage or community events. Blake, however, was becoming more agitated. Torres, you're not seriously buying this, are you? Regional Director? Come on, look at him. Does he look like he runs anything? The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Washington's expression hardened and Torres felt her stomach drop. Blake had just said exactly what she'd been afraid he was thinking all along. Officer Blake, Washington said quietly. What exactly do you mean by that? What do I look like to you? Blake realized he'd crossed a line, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I mean, you look like someone who's making up stories to get out of trouble. That's what I mean. Torres knew she had to act quickly before this situation spiraled completely out of control. She could see the anger building in Washington's eyes, and she didn't blame him. More importantly, she was starting to suspect that they were dealing with exactly who he said he was, which meant this incident was about to become a career-defining moment for both of them. Blake, I think we need to call this in, Torres said carefully. Call what in? We haven't arrested anybody. That's exactly why we need to call it in, Torres replied, hoping Blake would understand the gravity of what was happening. But Blake was too far down the rabbit hole to turn back now. Torres could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. She'd been in enough difficult situations to know when things were about to go very wrong, and right now, every instinct she had was screaming at her to de-escalate before Blake dug himself into a hole he couldn't climb out of. Blake, seriously, I think we should call Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, trying to keep her voice calm and professional. Blake turned to her with obvious frustration. Why, what's the big deal? I stopped someone who was acting suspicious, asked a few questions, and he's giving me attitude. That's what we do, Torres. That's police work. Washington had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, but he kept his voice level when he spoke. Officer Torres, I appreciate that you're trying to handle this professionally, but I need both of you to understand something. I am exactly who I say I am, and what's happening here is completely unacceptable. See? Blake jumped in. Now he's threatening us, probably going to claim we violated his civil rights or some garbage like that. The irony of Blake's statement wasn't lost on anyone present. Torres closed her eyes for a moment, feeling like she was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Washington looked at Blake with an expression that was equal parts amazement and anger. Officer Blake, do you have any idea what my job actually involves? Blake shrugged. I don't care what your job involves. Right now, you're someone who was acting suspiciously in a secure area, and I'm doing my job by checking you out. My job, Washington said slowly, involves investigating exactly this kind of situation. When police officers stop citizens without reasonable suspicion based on their race, when they refuse to accept legitimate identification, when they escalate routine encounters into confrontations, that's what I investigate, Officer Blake. That's what I do for a living. Torres felt her blood pressure spike. She was now certain they were dealing with a legitimate federal official, and Blake was making it worse with every word he spoke. Blake, however, seemed to think Washington was bluffing. Oh, so now you're going to investigate me? For doing my job? That's rich. Torres, are you hearing this? This guy thinks he's going to get me in trouble for asking questions. Blake, please, just let me call the sergeant, Torres pleaded. No, Blake said firmly. I'm not calling anyone until this guy stops playing games with us. If you really are some big-shot civil rights director, prove it. Show me a government ID, a business card, something official. Because right now, all I see is a driver's license that could belong to anyone. Washington reached into his jacket pocket again, this time pulling out a leather credential holder. He opened it to reveal a federal identification card with his photo, official title, and the Department of Justice seal. Torres stepped closer to examine it, and her heart sank. The ID was clearly authentic, complete with security features and official seals. The title read exactly what Washington had told them. Regional Director, Civil Rights Enforcement Division, United States Department of Justice. Blake, she said quietly, we need to end this right now. But Blake barely glanced at the federal ID. That could be fake too. These days you can get anything made. I've seen fake federal IDs before. Washington stared at Blake in disbelief. Officer, what exactly would it take to convince you that I am who I say I am? I've shown you my driver's license and my federal credentials. I've explained my presence here multiple times. What more do you want? I want to know what you were really doing in that restaurant for 90 minutes. I want to know why you're walking instead of driving. I want to know why someone in your supposed position is wandering around at night instead of being home where he belongs. The last comment hit Washington like a physical blow. Where I belong? Torres knew they had crossed a point of no return. She pulled out her radio and made the call before Blake could stop her. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. Can you please have Sergeant Rodriguez respond to the federal building? We need a supervisor on scene immediately. Blake spun around to face her. What are you doing? My job, Torres replied firmly, which is protecting both the department and the community from situations exactly like this one. Within minutes, they could see the headlights of Sergeant Rodriguez's patrol car approaching. Miguel Rodriguez had been with the force for 15 years and had worked his way up through the ranks by being smart, fair, and keeping his officers out of trouble. As he pulled up to the scene, he could immediately sense that something had gone seriously wrong. Rodriguez got out of his car and walked over to the group. He took one look at Washington, noting his expensive suit, federal ID holder still in his hand, and the expression of barely controlled anger on his face, and felt his stomach drop. What's the situation here? Rodriguez asked, though he was already starting to fear he knew exactly what had happened. Blake stepped forward eagerly, relieved to have a supervisor who would surely support his actions. Sarge, I stopped this individual for suspicious behavior around the federal building. He's been giving us a story about being some kind of government director, but I don't buy it. Something's not right about the whole thing. Rodriguez looked at Washington, really looked at him this time. Something about the man's face was familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he'd seen him before. Sir, can you tell me your name? Rodriguez asked. Dr. David Washington, Regional Director of Civil Rights Enforcement for the Department of Justice, Washington replied, handing over his federal credentials. Rodriguez examined the ID carefully, and as he read the name and title, a memory clicked into place. He'd seen this man at community meetings, police oversight hearings, and in news coverage of federal civil rights investigations. His face had been in departmental briefings about federal oversight of local police practices. The blood drained from Rodriguez's face as the full magnitude of what had happened hit him. Not only had Blake racially profiled an innocent citizen, he'd done it to one of the most powerful civil rights officials in the region. The man whose job it was to investigate exactly this kind of police misconduct. Oh my God, Rodriguez whispered, then caught himself. I mean, Dr. Washington, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced tonight. Blake looked confused. Sarge, what's going on? Why are you apologizing to him? Rodriguez turned to Blake with an expression that mixed anger, disappointment, and genuine fear for his officer's career. Blake, do you have any idea who you just stopped? Some guy claiming to be a civil rights director. Blake replied, still not grasping the situation. He's not claiming to be anything, Rodriguez said slowly. Dr. Washington is the federal official responsible for overseeing civil rights compliance in our region. His office has authority over police departments throughout the state. He's the person who investigates when officers violate citizens' constitutional rights. The words hit Blake like a physical blow. He looked at Washington, then at Rodriguez, then back at Washington, trying to process what he was hearing. But he was acting suspicious. He was walking around, going in and out of buildings. He was doing his job, Rodriguez said firmly, just like you were supposed to be doing yours. Washington spoke up for the first time since Rodriguez arrived. Sergeant, I want to be clear about something. I wasn't acting suspicious. I had dinner with a colleague from the Attorney General's office to discuss an ongoing investigation. I returned to my office to review some files before going home. I did nothing that would justify being stopped and questioned except walking while black in a neighborhood where Officer Blake apparently didn't think I belonged. Rodriguez knew that everything Washington said was absolutely true, and he knew that this incident was going to have consequences that would ripple through the entire department. Dr. Washington, On behalf of the department, I want to apologize for what happened here tonight. This should never have occurred. Blake finally seemed to understand that something had gone very wrong. Wait, he's really? Yes, Blake, Rodriguez said quietly. He's really exactly who he said he was from the beginning. Washington looked at Blake with an expression that was more disappointed than angry. Officer Blake, do you understand now why I remained calm during your questioning? Do you understand why I wasn't nervous or defensive? It's because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew that being black and walking down a public street isn't a crime, even though you seem to think it was. Blake opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. For the first time since the encounter began, he was speechless. Rodriguez pulled out his radio. Dispatch, I need you to connect me with Chief Hamilton immediately. Tell him it's urgent. As Rodriguez waited for the call to go through, he looked at the scene around him. Blake standing in stunned silence, Torres looking like she wanted to disappear, Washington maintaining his dignity despite everything that had happened, and he knew that this night was going to change all of their lives forever. The radio crackled to life with the chief's voice, and Rodriguez took a deep breath before beginning what would be one of the most difficult conversations of his career. Rodriguez held the radio close to his mouth, choosing his words carefully. He knew that once he made this call there would be no going back, no way to contain what had happened. Chief Hamilton, this is Rodriguez. I'm at the federal building with a situation that requires your immediate attention. Chief Hamilton's voice came through clearly, with the tone of someone who'd been woken up but was trying to sound alert. What kind of situation, Miguel? Rodriguez glanced at Washington, who was watching him intently, then at Blake, who still looked like he was in shock. Chief, we have an officer who stopped and questioned Dr. David Washington, the Regional Director of Civil Rights Enforcement for the DOJ. The stop appears to have been without reasonable suspicion. There was a long pause on the radio, so long that Rodriguez wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Hamilton's voice came back, much more awake now. Did you say David Washington? The Federal Civil Rights Director? Yes, sir. Another pause. Is Dr. Washington still on scene? Yes, sir. He's cooperating fully, but he's understandably upset about what happened. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't let anyone leave. And don't discuss this with anyone else until I arrive. The radio went quiet, leaving the four of them standing in an uncomfortable silence under the streetlights. Rodriguez looked at his watch. 10:23 p.m. In the distance, he could see a few people with cell phones who had apparently been recording parts of the encounter. His heart sank as he realized this incident might already be spreading on social media. Washington broke the silence. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to know that I don't hold you responsible for what happened here tonight. You handled this professionally once you arrived. Thank you, Dr. Washington. I wish I could have prevented it entirely. Blake finally found his voice. Sarge, I was just doing my job. He really did look suspicious. Washington turned to face Blake directly. Officer Blake, I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. I looked suspicious? I was wearing a business suit, carrying a briefcase and walking on a public sidewalk. What exactly looked suspicious about that? Blake struggled to find an answer that didn't sound terrible. You were going in and out of the building at unusual hours, with a valid key card and legitimate business there, and you were walking instead of driving, which is legal last I checked. Blake was quiet for a moment, then said, I've seen people case buildings before. I know what to look for. Washington shook his head sadly. Officer Blake, in your mind, what does someone who cases buildings look like? It was a trap, and Blake knew it. Whatever he said would either be a lie, or would reveal the racial bias that had driven his actions. He chose to remain silent. Torres, who had been quiet since calling for Rodriguez, finally spoke up. Dr. Washington, I want to apologize for not intervening sooner. I should have recognized what was happening and stopped it. Officer Torres, you did try to de-escalate the situation. I noticed that, and I appreciate it. Rodriguez's radio crackled again. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Chief Hamilton. I'm 2 minutes out. Has anyone else arrived on scene? Rodriguez looked around and noticed that a small crowd of pedestrians had gathered at a respectful distance, most with their phones out. Chief, we have several civilians observing and some appear to be recording. Understood. We'll deal with that when I get there. True to his word, Chief Hamilton's unmarked car pulled up exactly 2 minutes later. Robert Hamilton had been chief of police for 6 years, and in that time he'd worked hard to improve community relations and avoid the kind of incidents that had plagued other departments. As he got out of his car and approached the group, Washington could see the genuine distress on his face. "Dr. Washington," Hamilton said, extending his hand. "I'm Chief Hamilton. I want to personally apologize for what happened tonight." Washington shook the chief's hand. "Chief Hamilton, I appreciate you coming out here personally. I know it's late." Hamilton looked around at the scene, the patrol cars with their lights still flashing, the small crowd of onlookers, and his officers standing in various states of discomfort. "Dr. Washington, would you be willing to give me a brief account of what happened here?" Washington nodded and began recounting the evening's events. He spoke calmly and factually, describing Blake's initial approach, his escalating questions, his refusal to accept Washington's identification and explanations, and his increasingly hostile attitude. As Washington spoke, Hamilton's expression grew more and more grim. He'd dealt with misconduct cases before, but never anything this potentially damaging to the department. When Washington finished, Hamilton turned to Rodriguez. "Sergeant, what's your assessment of the situation?" Rodriguez chose his words carefully. "Chief, from what I observed when I arrived, Dr. Washington was cooperative and professional throughout. He provided identification and explained his presence. Officer Blake seemed convinced that Dr. Washington was lying about his identity and position, despite being shown both a driver's license and federal credentials." Hamilton nodded, then turned to Torres. "Officer Torres, you were the second responder?"
"Yes, sir."
"When I arrived, Officer Blake was questioning Dr. Washington's story. I examined his identification and it appeared completely legitimate to me. I tried to suggest that we call for a supervisor, but Officer Blake wanted to continue the questioning. Finally, Hamilton turned to Blake. "Officer Blake, I want to hear your version of events." Blake straightened up, trying to sound confident. "Chief, I observed an individual behaving suspiciously around the federal building. He was going in and out having dinner, walking around late at night. It seemed unusual, so I approached him to ask questions. He claimed to be some kind of government director, but the whole story seemed off to me. I was just being thorough." Hamilton listened without interrupting, then asked, "What specifically made Dr. Washington's behavior seem suspicious to you?" Blake hesitated. "Well, he was in the area multiple times and he was walking instead of driving and it was late at night. And in your training and experience, those factors constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity?" I thought they did." Washington had been listening to this exchange and he could see that Blake still didn't understand the real problem. "Chief Hamilton, if I may, I think it's important to note that Officer Blake continued to question my identity, even after I showed him my federal credentials. He suggested they might be fake." Hamilton's face darkened. "Is that correct, Officer Blake?" Blake looked around desperately, realizing that everything he said was making things worse. "Chief, you have to understand fake IDs are getting really sophisticated these days. I've seen some good ones. But you made no attempt to verify Dr. Washington's credentials through proper channels?" "No, sir." Hamilton pulled Rodriguez aside for a private conversation that lasted several minutes. Washington could see them talking intently, occasionally glancing back at the group. When they returned, Hamilton's expression was stone-cold serious. "Officer Blake, I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation of this incident. You'll report to Internal Affairs tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Until then, you're relieved of duty." Blake's face went white. "Chief, this is crazy. I was doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve all citizens of this community with fairness and respect," Hamilton replied firmly. "From what I've heard tonight, that's not what happened here." Hamilton turned to Washington. "Dr. Washington, I know this has been an extremely unpleasant experience. I want you to know that we take this matter very seriously. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, and we'll be implementing additional training to ensure this doesn't happen again. Chief Hamilton, I appreciate your response tonight. However, I think you should know that this incident was recorded by several witnesses." Washington gestured toward the small crowd that was still watching from a distance. "By morning, this will likely be on social media and possibly picked up by news outlets." Hamilton nodded grimly. "I understand. We'll be prepared to address this publicly." As the group began to disperse, Washington looked back at Blake one more time. "Officer Blake, I hope you'll take some time to think about what really happened here tonight. I hope you'll consider what it feels like to be judged not by your actions or your character, but by assumptions based on your appearance." Blake didn't respond, but Washington could see something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. As Washington walked toward his car in the federal building parking garage, the car he'd been planning to use all along, he thought about the report he would have to write, the meetings he would have to attend, and the investigation that would surely follow. But mostly he thought about how, even after 8 years as a civil rights director and 15 years in civil rights law, he could still be made to feel like a criminal for the simple act of walking down a public street. The badge and the credentials and the position didn't matter when someone looked at him and saw only what Officer Blake had seen. That was the lesson he would carry from this night, and it was a lesson that would shape everything that came next. 3 weeks after that night outside the federal building, Washington sat in his office reviewing the preliminary report from the police department's internal investigation. The findings were exactly what he had expected. Officer Blake had conducted an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion, had failed to properly verify legitimate identification, and had demonstrated clear evidence of racial bias in his decision-making process. The video footage from witnesses' cell phones had indeed made it to social media within hours of the incident, and by the next morning, local news stations were running the story. The headline that appeared most frequently was "Civil Rights Director Racially Profiled by Local Police." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Washington's phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Carmen. "Saw the news interview with Chief Hamilton. He handled it well. How are you feeling about everything?" He typed back, "Better than I expected. I think something good might come from this, and something good was coming from it, though it had taken weeks of difficult conversations, heated meetings, and careful planning to get there." The first change had come quickly. Chief Hamilton had announced a complete review of the department's policies on investigatory stops, community policing, and bias training. But Washington had suggested they go further than just policy changes. "Chief," Washington had said during one of their many meetings, "policy changes are important, but they're not enough. Your officers need to understand not just what they should do, but why it matters. They need to hear from the community members who are affected by their decisions." That conversation had led to the creation of something unprecedented in the city's police department, a community impact partnership. Instead of traditional classroom-style bias training, officers would participate in structured dialogues with community members who had experienced police interactions from the other side. Washington had volunteered to be one of the first community participants, despite Carmen's concerns about reliving the experience over and over again. "David, you don't have to do this," she had told him. "You've already been through enough." "That's exactly why I need to do this," he had replied. "If my experience can help prevent this from happening to someone else, then it wasn't for nothing." The first community dialogue session was held on a Thursday evening in the police department's community room. 12 officers attended, including Torres, who had volunteered to participate in the pilot program. Blake was not present. He had resigned from the department rather than face the internal investigation, though Washington had heard through Chief Hamilton that Blake was considering applying to another department in a different state. Washington walked into the room feeling nervous, which surprised him. He'd testified before Congress, argued cases in federal court, and given presentations to audiences of hundreds, but something about sitting in a circle with police officers and telling his story felt more intimidating than any of that. The session was facilitated by Dr. Jennifer Chen, a psychologist who specialized in police community relations. She began by explaining the ground rules. Everyone would have a chance to speak without interruption. Questions would be asked respectfully, and the goal was understanding, not blame. "Dr. Washington," Dr. Chen began, "would you be willing to start by telling us about your experience?" Washington took a deep breath and began. He told the story from the beginning, leaving his dinner meeting, walking back to his office, being stopped by Blake. But this time, he also talked about what it felt like. "The hardest part wasn't being questioned," he said. "Police officers have a job to do, and I understand that. The hardest part was realizing that nothing I could say or do would convince Officer Blake that I belonged where I was. Not my clothes, not my credentials, not my explanation. In his mind, I had already been judged and found guilty of being black in the wrong neighborhood. Officer Martinez, a young patrolman who had only been on the force for 2 years, raised his hand. "Dr. Washington, how did you stay so calm?" "I mean, if someone wasn't believing me about who I was, I think I'd get pretty angry." Washington smiled. "I did get angry, Officer Martinez, but I've learned that expressing anger in situations like that often makes things worse. When a black man gets angry at a police officer, it's seen as threatening, as proof that he's dangerous. So I had to swallow my anger and try to remain professional, even though I was being treated like a criminal." Torres spoke up next. "Dr. Washington, I want to apologize again for not doing more that night. Looking back, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't trust my instincts enough to really challenge my partner." "Officer Torres, you did more than you think. You called for backup, you examined my credentials objectively, and you tried to de-escalate the situation. Those actions mattered." For the next hour, they talked about implicit bias, about how assumptions can override evidence, about the difference between being suspicious and appearing suspicious to someone who already has preconceived notions. Officer Williams, a veteran with 15 years on the force, asked the question that Washington had been expecting. "Dr. Washington, do you think Officer Blake is a bad person? Do you think he's a racist?" Washington considered the question carefully. "I don't know Officer Blake personally, so I can't judge his character. But I can tell you that his actions that night were based on racist assumptions, whether he recognized them or not. The fact that he looked at me and immediately assumed I didn't belong in that neighborhood, that I couldn't possibly be who I said I was, that I must be lying, those assumptions have their roots in racial bias. But what if he didn't realize he was being biased?" Williams pressed. "What if he really thought he was just doing his job?" "Then that makes it even more important that we're having this conversation," Washington replied. "If Officer Blake had recognized his bias, he might have stopped himself. If he had thought twice about why he found me suspicious, he might have realized that his reasons weren't legitimate. The goal isn't to make officers feel guilty about having biases. We all have them. The goal is to make them aware of their biases so they can make better decisions." As the session wound down, Dr. Chen asked each participant to share one thing they would take away from the evening. When it was Washington's turn, he said, "I'm taking away hope. Hope that this conversation is the beginning of something better for this community." 6 months later, the Community Impact Partnership had become a model program that was being studied by police departments across the state. Washington had participated in 8 more sessions, each time sharing his story with different groups of officers. But the real test came on a Tuesday evening in September when Washington was walking to his car after another late night at the office. He saw a patrol car slow down as it approached him, and for a moment his heart rate increased. The car pulled over and Officer Torres got out. "Dr. Washington, good evening," she said with a smile. "Working late again?" "Hello, Officer Torres. Yes, we have a big case coming up next week. Well, be safe getting home, and thank you again for everything you've done with the partnership program. It's made a real difference." As Torres drove away, Washington realized that this was what change looked like. Not dramatic transformation overnight, but small moments of recognition and respect, building one interaction at a time. His phone buzzed with another text from Carmen. "How was the session tonight?" He looked around at the quiet street, the federal building behind him, and the taillights of Torres's patrol car disappearing around the corner. "Hopeful," he typed back. It was hopeful. Washington had learned that sometimes the worst experiences can become the foundation for the most meaningful change. The night he was racially profiled by Officer Blake had been humiliating and infuriating, but it had also opened a door to conversations that might never have happened otherwise. As he drove home through the city streets, Washington thought about Blake, who had moved to another state and, according to Chief Hamilton, was working as a security guard at a shopping mall. He wondered if Blake ever thought about that night, if he ever questioned the assumptions that had led to his resignation from the police force. Washington hoped he did. Because real change happened not just in policy manuals and training programs, but in moments of self-reflection, in the uncomfortable realization that we might not be who we think we are. The Community Impact Partnership was now being replicated in 12 other cities. Washington received calls from police chiefs, civil rights organizations, and community groups wanting to learn from what had happened in his city. The key, he would tell them, is not to treat these incidents as isolated events. They're opportunities to examine the systems and attitudes that allow them to happen in the first place. A year later, Washington was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. As he stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of law enforcement officials, civil rights advocates, and community leaders, he began with the words that had become his signature opening. "Let me tell you about the night I was racially profiled while walking to my office. It was the worst thing that could have happened to me, and it was also the best thing that could have happened to my community. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it wasn't complete. There was still work to be done, more conversations to be had, more officers to train, and more community members to engage. But on that night a year ago, when Officer Blake looked at Washington and saw only what his biases allowed him to see, neither of them could have imagined that the encounter would become the catalyst for the kind of change that Washington had been working toward his entire career. Sometimes progress comes through legislation and court cases. Sometimes it comes through policy changes and official reforms. And sometimes it comes through one difficult conversation at a time, one moment of recognition at a time, one person willing to examine their assumptions at a time. That night outside the federal building had taught Washington that all three approaches were necessary. But it was the conversations, the human connections formed in rooms where officers and community members looked each other in the eye and talked honestly about bias, fear, and hope, that had the power to create lasting change. As he finished his speech and looked out at the audience, Washington saw police officers and community activists sitting side by side, taking notes, asking questions, and beginning the kind of conversations that he knew would continue long after the conference ended. It wasn't the ending he would have chosen for his story, but it was an ending that gave him hope for all the stories yet to be written.